He walked into that ballroom quietly, just another black man in a room full of people who believed they owned the night. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his power. All they saw was someone they thought didn't belong, someone they could embarrass without consequence. And when a glass of red wine spilled across his suit, the room laughed, unaware that the man they mocked stood at the center of the very deal they depended on. What happened next would expose more than arrogance. It would reveal a truth they never expected. Comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Anthony Carter lived most of his life in quiet strength, moving through the world with the calm confidence of a man who had learned early that dignity was something you protect, even when others try to take it from you. In boardrooms, he carried himself with precision. In private, he kept his world simple, focused, and intentional. What people never saw was the path he walked to get there, the long hours, the silent sacrifices, and the determination that turned struggle into success. He didn't flash his achievements, didn't announce his victories. That was never his style. Anthony believed people revealed themselves when they thought no one important was watching. On the evening of the gala, he arrived with the same quiet presence he carried everywhere. The hotel ballroom shimmered with polished surfaces and practiced smiles, a place where wealth spoke louder than respect. Anthony entered alone, unnoticed by most, underestimated by the rest. He moved through the room with steady steps, observing the people who carried themselves like the world belonged to them. They saw only what they wanted to see, a black man in a space they believed wasn't his. There was tension in the air, subtle but sharp. Eyes lingered a little too long. Conversations paused when he passed. Whispers traveled behind perfectly raised glasses. Anthony felt the familiar weight of being misjudged, the quiet pressure that came whenever he stepped into rooms built on assumptions. But he didn't react. He never did. Tonight, especially, required control. The people filling the ballroom had no idea how much their future depended on the man they overlooked. Executives talked loudly about the massive partnership they expected to finalize. Guests bragged about the deal like it already belonged to them. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a moment was approaching that would expose the real cost of their arrogance. Anthony could feel it building, subtle, electric, inevitable. He just didn't expect the spark to come from the people who believed they stood above him. The deeper Anthony Carter moved into the ballroom, the clearer the divide became. Wealth shimmered across the room, but underneath the glow was something colder, an unspoken rule about who belonged and who didn't. Anthony felt the shift as soon as he approached the center aisle. People didn't step aside. They tightened their circles. They didn't greet him. They examined him. And even in a room full of expensive suits and glittering gowns, the sharpness of their assumptions cut the loudest. A server passed by with a tray of wine, and two guests leaned in, speaking just low enough to pretend their words weren't meant for him. But they were. They always were. They joked about staff slipping into VIP and how standards had changed. A couple even glanced at Anthony's suit, tailored, understated, and smirked like it didn't measure up to their idea of wealth. They saw him as invisible until they needed a target, and tonight, they needed one. Anthony ignored the noise. He always had. He was here for a purpose, and he wasn't going to hand anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. Yet, as he stood near a column, allowing the crowd to move around him, the first wave of direct confrontation came quicker than expected. A man with a polished haircut and a suit that screamed self-importance walked straight toward him. Bradley Huxley, one of the company's senior executives, wore arrogance like cologne. Bradley tapped Anthony's sleeve lightly, the kind of gesture meant to establish dominance. Without saying it, his eyes said everything. "You don't belong here." Anthony stayed still. He didn't flinch, didn't break posture. He simply met the man's gaze with calm, steady silence. Bradley's smirk widened. He gestured toward a server. "Looks like we've got someone confused about their section," he said proudly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A wave of poorly hidden chuckles followed. Anthony's jaw stayed relaxed. He refused to shrink for anyone. But then she appeared, Brooke Huxley, Bradley's wife. Dressed in shimmering fabric and entitlement, she glided forward with a glass of red wine she picked up without acknowledging the server who offered it. Her eyes scanned Anthony from head to toe, not with curiosity, but with disgust disguised as amusement. In her mind, she wasn't approaching a man. She was approaching someone she thought was beneath her. She lifted the wine glass slightly, and her voice carried across the room with practiced sweetness. "If you're going to stand in VIP," she said, "at least be useful. Take this to table 5. The way she held the glass out, like an order, not a request, made nearby guests turn their heads. They waited for Anthony to obey, expecting him to fold into the role they assigned him. He didn't move. Brooke's smile faltered. Bradley stepped closer, taking the glass from her hand, his ego sparking under the attention of the crowd. And without hesitation, without concern, he lifted the wine high enough for everyone to see. Then he tipped it. The red poured onto Anthony's suit, staining the fabric like a deliberate wound. Gasps rippled across the room. Someone covered their mouth. Another whispered, "He really did that." A phone lifted quietly. Then another. Humiliation wasn't an accident. It was entertainment for them. Anthony didn't react, not in the way they expected. He wiped the edge of his jaw slowly, his expression calm, almost unreadable. The ballroom buzzed with whispers, each one sharper than the last. He straightened his posture, and then he walked away. Through the shock, through the cameras, through the entitlement that believed it had won. What no one realized, not Brooke, not Bradley, not the 200 guests watching with smug certainty, was that the moment Anthony stepped into that hallway, the real fallout had already begun. Inside the ballroom, arrogance believed it had scored a victory. Outside the ballroom, power had quietly started to move. Inside the ballroom, the night collapsed faster than anyone realized. The music cut mid-note, screens flickered, and conversations froze as executives rushed toward their phones with growing panic. What began as a cruel attempt to humiliate a man they dismissed as insignificant was now unraveling in real time, and no one could stop it. Bradley Huxley was the first to sense something was wrong. His confident smirk faded when he saw the host step off stage, face pale, whispering urgently into his headset. A knot of board members formed near the staircase, each one staring at their screens as if the numbers flashing across them couldn't be real. Notifications poured in rapid, relentless, catastrophic. Accounts frozen, contracts voided. Partnership terms collapsed. Every message carried the same signature, action initiated by primary owner. At first, they didn't understand what that meant. Then the room became suffocatingly still. Across the ballroom, someone tapped a friend and pointed at their phone. A video played. The moment Bradley dumped wine on Anthony, Brooke laughing in the background, guests smirking like spectators at a show. A caption sat beneath the clip. They humiliated a black man they thought was staff. He walked out like he owned the place. The video spread like wildfire screen to screen, table to table, until the entire room watched their arrogance play out from an angle none of them expected. Gasps echoed, whispers sharpened, and faces fell as reality hit harder than the humiliation they had served. Brooke's hand trembled around her clutch, her confidence drained, replaced by fear she couldn't mask. "Fix it," she hissed to Bradley, voice cracking. "Now." Fix it. But Bradley was no longer the man in control. He wasn't even close. A board member stormed up to him, eyes burning with anger. "Do you know who you offended tonight?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Bradley tried to speak, but the board member cut him off with a single truth that hit the room like a shockwave. Anthony Carter is the majority owner of the partner company. The entire $800 million deal was his. The words dropped heavier than the silence that followed. Brooke staggered back as if the floor shifted beneath her. Bradley's breath caught in his chest. Guests exchanged horrified looks. Someone whispered, "He wasn't staff, he was the deal." And in that moment, every laugh, every insult, every assumption replayed with brutal clarity. The humiliation they believed they had inflicted on a powerless man had done something far worse. It exposed exactly who they were. Phones buzzed again, this time with breaking news alerts. Partnership suspended, value plummeting, investors walking away, a public relations disaster igniting in real time. Inside the ballroom, panic spread like fire. Outside the hotel, Anthony walked deeper into the night, shoulders steady, expression calm, while the empire built on arrogance began to crumble behind him. And the worst part for them? The fallout had only just begun. By the next morning, the truth had spread far beyond the ballroom. Headlines filled every screen, clips of the wine spilling across Anthony's suit, the shocked faces, the arrogance on display. What the guests assumed was a small moment of humiliation had become a public reckoning. Bradley and Brooke Huxley found themselves at the center of a collapse they never imagined. Investors withdrew, partners resigned, careers that once seemed untouchable unraveled overnight. But Anthony Carter didn't celebrate their downfall. That was never who he was. He woke early, as he always did, moving through his home with the same quiet discipline. He didn't need revenge to feel whole. He didn't need applause to feel powerful. What mattered was something deeper, knowing that dignity, his dignity, was intact, untouched by the people who tried to take it from him. When Bradley and Brooke eventually arrived at his quiet doorstep, desperate and shaken, Anthony listened, not for excuses or apologies, but for understanding. And when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of every moment like this, every injustice that had echoed through generations. "You didn't lose everything last night," he said calmly. "You lost it the moment you decided someone's worth was measured by your comfort." He closed the door gently, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Their consequences were theirs to face. His life, his legacy, would move forward untouched. And that's what made his story more than a single moment of prejudice. It reflected a reality far too familiar: how quickly a black man can be judged, dismissed, or dehumanized when people assume he has no power, and how often those same people forget that power doesn't always look like what they expect. Anthony's silence was never weakness. It was restraint. It was grace. It was strength they failed to recognize until the consequences arrived. But the question his story leaves behind is bigger than the deal they lost or the empire that crumbled. How many times will this happen before people learn to see beyond their assumptions? How many lives will be diminished before dignity is given without being earned? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen.